Hi. So I made this dining room table about 5 years ago, and it's served us really well. It's stayed nice and flat, and it's nice and sturdy. But as luck would have it, this is the year that everyone is showing up for Thanksgiving. So we're going to need a bigger table. So my thought isn't to build an extension for this table, but to make a second table that will work with this table. So this table is 40 inches wide, and what I'd like to do is build the second table 40 inches wide by 50 inches long. And the original table is 40 by 80 inches, and the way that it was held up is it has a leg at each corner, and those legs each have an arm, and those arms face towards the middle of the table, and they connect to a stretcher that runs down the center of the table. The new table, being 40 by 50, is closer to a square. And what I'm hoping is I can have the same legs with the same arms, and the arms will come into a center point in the middle of the table. So I won't need the stretcher. If we go way back in time, about 10, I think even a little more than 10 years ago, I cut up a big Sequoia tree with my friend Brian. I've talked about this tree in the past, and I've built a few other projects with the wood. This was the first time I'd really milled up anything, and we learned quite a lot in doing this, and it took quite a while cutting up this big tree. I think if we did this now, we could probably do it in about half the time, as I know so much more about how to do this. The wood's been sitting all this time, and I think it's been moved around a few times. I brought in a few slabs to the shop. I think I brought in 3, and I ended up only needing 2. And I think one of them I even switched out. So I think in the end I brought 4 pieces in. It's not quite as heavy as it looks. This is very light, sort of non-dense wood. Think of it like big pieces of foam. I cut one of the pieces down just a little bit to get the sides a little more vertical. And with this piece, I think I'm going to make the legs and arms. So the first thing I wanted to do was to cut the little cutouts for my hold downs on the CNC machine. I think this drill press now is pretty much used for doing this. I have a scrap piece of plywood on the drill press that I can drill down to, and that'll give me the thickness of the little cutout will be about the right height for the hold downs on the CNC machine. It doesn't have to be exact, it just has to not be too thin. This piece wasn't perfectly flat, of course, so I used shims at some of the places where it was up from the CNC bed. And you can see how the hold downs fit into the little cutouts. Then it's just a matter of flattening the slab. I've got a cheap 2-inch bit in the spindle, which works pretty well. It's nice because it can be run at 20,000 RPM, I think, so I can set the CNC to go at 300 inches per minute. So the flattening goes pretty fast. I realized at this point I should have cut the cutouts on the drill press on both sides while I had the piece over there. So I had to take the piece back to the drill press and put the cutouts on the other side. And I started to flatten this side. I think this is going to be the bottom. Yeah, I think so. I think I started it and did about 1/3 of it and decided it should be a little deeper. So I lowered the spindle and started the whole slab over again. Even with the brush on the spindle, the sawdust still gets away a little bit. When doing the legs and arms, so you can see where I tried to make this all sort of flush, and this joint has kind of opened up a little bit. So what I'd like to do, I think, is to just get rid of it, round this over and round this over, so that this place where it's coming apart just kind of goes away. Just make it come apart, I guess. So that I think will be the design on the new table. I thought about making the little sort of puzzle shape a little more varied with some little cutouts in that, but I decided it was a little too overdone, so I just left it simple. I made a test piece to make sure my fit was going to be okay. I've forgotten exactly what my little extra bit of measurement I added. I want to say it was either 6 or 7 thousandths of an inch, just so they'd fit. Once I had everything working, I could start cutting out the actual pieces. Now I know it seems a little sacrificial to cut up this big slab to make these little parts, but these little parts have to come from somewhere. Once I had this cut out, I had this idea that I could fill the cutouts in the leftover piece with resin and make this the tabletop, so that you're looking through the cutouts at the pieces that have been cut out. But I didn't take that route, but it was a nice idea. So I have to go fairly deep with these. I think this is 2 inches thick, so I've got a 1/2 inch bit on here, which makes a pretty wide cut. But they're simple shapes, so it works okay. I was doing them one at a time just to kind of be careful, and it all went fine in the end. There were some bark intrusions in this piece and some knots that I was trying to get around as well. So I couldn't really use the whole slab for the parts I was making. I was using it like it was a big sheet of plywood, but it really wasn't a big sheet of plywood. I can take the pieces out. I used bridges to hold them in place, which worked pretty well, which meant I had little tabs to cut off. I got this nice old trim router that I've been wanting to use, and this was the chance to use it, and it worked really well. And I can sand some of the edges with the spindle sander. I was careful on the part that's going to be the joint, as I didn't want to take off too much. And I face jointed the legs and arms just to get the tooling marks from the CNC machine off. With the legs, I want to make a pin at the top of the leg. I can mount the leg on my vertical hold down table. Then I can cut that cylinder into the end of the leg. Once I had one set up and working, I could put the other 3 in very easily. They would slide up against the fence, and I could have the router bit at its 0 height, and I could slide the leg up to the router bit, and it would be set at the right height. Then I wanted to round over the outside corners of the legs, so I did that on the shaper. That'll be the part of the table that you might bump with your knees while you're sitting at the table. I can put the arms and legs aside now, and I can start working on the top. So I found a nice piece that was as flat as I could find. And this part of the tree was almost 40 inches wide, but not quite. I was going to have to add to this piece just a little bit. So I cut it closer to the length that I needed. And there was a section in the middle that was a little bit less than perfect. Let's say it that way. Cracked and not really rotten, but just not the strongest wood in the tree, let's say. So I wanted to cut that section out of the middle. Cut it first with the circular saw. Then I cut the other side on the bandsaw. It seemed like it'd be just a little bit easier. And I found a piece of maple that I had that would be thick enough to infill in the tabletop. And I want this piece of maple to have a little bit of a wedge shape, as the piece of Sequoia is a little wedge shape, so I want to have the maple make up that geometry. So I'll end up with something close to a rectangle in the end, and I'll have my 40-inch width. I jointed all of the edges that will go together on these 3 pieces. My biggest layout surface is the CNC table, so I laid the pieces out on that. And what's nice about that is once they're glued up, they're in the right place to then be flattened. In thinking about the previous slab and how I had drilled the cutouts for the hold downs, I laid out the pieces for the top, and I marked where my slots for the hold downs would be on the table. Then I could drill the cutouts for the hold downs on the pieces Instead of having to move the whole glued up section over to the drill press, I could bring just the pieces over to the drill press. I remembered to drill both sides, so I wouldn't have to move the whole piece back over to the drill press when I wanted to flip it over. And I let that dry overnight. And I can put the hold downs in place now. And it's, again, not perfectly flat, so I have some wedges under the high spots. And it's just a lot of flattening now. You can see how the brush kind of keeps some chips in, but the chips kind of go all over the place as well. And I went over it again. It wasn't quite deep enough. I think this is going to be the top. So I actually don't quite want to go as deep as the final just yet, as I'm going to put some inlays into this. And I'll want to do a sort of a finish pass with that. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think this might be the bottom. I took it off, and there were little bits of glue on the CNC table. I wanted to scrape those off before I flipped the piece over. As my new flat top, yeah, no, it's the top. What I want is a really flat CNC table, so my nice flat tabletop will sit exactly flush with the table. And I won't get any indents from any little bits of glue or anything. So now I can work on the bottom. So this is the bottom of the top. And now it sits nice and flat on the table. It should be nice and solid. And I can flatten this now. And this I just wanted to get pretty close to flat, as I was going to be carving the underside with a shape. And I can clean that up again. Every time I clean up all the sawdust. And there was a branch or a knot with some bark in the wood that I wanted to get out. I guess Sequoia bark has a lot of silicate in it, so it can dull the blades quickly. Now I wanted to make the inlays for the top. So I found a piece of, I think this is cherry, and I cut it in half, and I can sort of book match it, mostly just to get a wider piece. And it doesn't have to be real thick. I think I made 2 of these. And I can cut out the inlays with this cherry. Since I have cats on the other table, I'll do cats again. I have the same drawings saved, so I can use some of those shapes. I'm doing just a straight vertical inlay, as it's a little quicker, and it's not so much that it works better, but it tends not to have as many issues. I thought about doing a real detailed inlay with a V-carve. I decided this was more about just getting the table done than trying to make some super fancy thing on the top. So I cut out the holes for the plugs. I like to do the plugs first, so I can make sure they fit when I do the hole. And if the hole's too small and it's still mounted in place, I can make it bigger. If I've done the hole first, and then I make the plug, and I move the plug and try and get it in the hole and it doesn't fit, I then have to cut a whole new plug with a different size. So I think there was a knot, and then there was a couple of spots that weren't quite as nice on the top that I just wanted to cover up with the inlays. I lifted the whole piece up so I could fit the clamps underneath the piece. That's why it's being lifted. And because they're vertical inlays, I drilled some relief holes for the air to get out. Once you put the glue and the inlay in, you'll get a pocket of air in there. And if there isn't a way for it to get out, it's really hard to get the inlay in. And you almost don't really need the clamps, but they can't hurt. And while the inlay's dry, I could put the legs and arms together. I wanted to make sure the arm idea was going to work. I had it sort of in my mind that the arms wouldn't be in line with each other as they came to the center. But then in seeing it and thinking about it, if it's a rectangle and they're going to the center, then the arms are going to be in line. And really what I could have and maybe should have done was to make 2 arms with a notch in the middle so they'd fit together instead of 4 different arms. That would have been a little bit simpler and possibly a more rigid structure. And that bit in the center would be a little stronger. Right now it's a little tenuous with the little tab sticking out and a single bolt holding it together. I was trying to get a single hole right down the middle of all four of the tabs. And it worked in the end with a hammer. And I can take that apart and sand the rest of the sides. And I marked where I wanted the glue to be on the joint. And I can put the glue in place, which is just a matter of spreading it around on the joint. And they weren't quite as tight of a fit as I was hoping for, but they'll work fine. And I got them as flat as I could. And there's really no way to clamp this. There's nothing to clamp, really. I just have to make sure it's straight and planar and it's where I want it, because that's where it's going to be. As the legs dried, I can flatten the top with the inlays. So this will be sort of the final pass on the top. Now for the bottom, I need to flip it over one last time. I wanted to have a sort of structural ring that runs around the bottom. So the tabletop is thin at the edge, and there's a cutout in the middle just to make it a little lighter. But there's sort of a ring where the top is thicker that connects the four legs. So I made a plane in Blender, and I divided it into a bunch of sections, or a bunch of squares. I sort of selected the ring that I wanted, and I lifted that up with an edge that was sort of soft, so it would sort of pull up the surrounding squares. And I'd get sort of a ringed beam around the inside of the bottom of the table. And I can lay out the legs just to kind of make sure they're going to fit and kind of see where they're going to fall. And I base that model on the size of the dimension between the pins on the legs. I can do the roughing pass to carve out that shape on the underside of the table. And for this, I'm using a 1-inch router bit. So it's not quite as big and flat as the 2-inch, but it's still big enough that it goes pretty fast, as it needs to take out quite a bit of material on the inside. For the finishing pass, I wanted the router bit to run perpendicular to the edge, or to the form of the beam that I was making. I didn't want it to run parallel with that shape, as I would get a bunch of steps, like you can see with the roughing pass. So I was using a 1/2-inch bit for the finishing pass. So what I did is I figured out how to make it cut the finishing pass in quadrants. And within each of those triangular quadrants, I could have it run perpendicular to the edge, or to the form that I was trying to cut out. And that gave me a much smoother curved surface, while also cutting it fairly quickly with a somewhat large bit with somewhat large stepovers. And what that meant is I was fairly close to the final form once this was done, and I would just have to sand it a little bit to get the machining marks off, and I wouldn't have to really be shaping anything. And it even did the corners really well, which was nice. And it's done, and that worked better than I had expected. With the form on the underside of the table cut, I can see if the legs are in fact in the right location. They really should be. And it looks good. At this point, I needed to figure out where the holes for the pins in the legs needed to fall on the underside of the table. So I measured those very carefully and did a drawing of those 4 holes. And I could have the machine cut those mortises. And it's a little rough on this first pass. Then I had the machine go back and do a finishing pass, the full depth of the router bit. This made the holes the right size, and it gave a nice surface on the inside of the holes. And I can bring the legs back and make sure they're in the right place. And with a little work, I managed to get them to go in, and it looked like it was going to be just fine. Then I can cut the top out of the bigger piece of wood. And I had a few tabs that actually worked, so I could remove those. I was really only holding this piece from the ends, as I couldn't really hold it from the sides as it was too wide. And it should be basically done, just some sanding now. I needed to shorten the pins on the legs. I'm not sure why I didn't just cut them to the right length in the first place. So I just set up the radial arm saw with an angle to cut the tops of the pins. I think the holes are an inch deep, so I'm making these about 7/8 of an inch long. And these won't have any glue on them. They'll just be sitting there under the table. So if the table needs to be moved, the top can come off and the legs can be taken apart. I can sand the legs and arms. I can sand the bottom of the tabletop. And this was really just removing the machine marks. And it wasn't flat, so it was a little tricky to kind of get into all of the angles. But it wasn't too bad. And it's the bottom, so I'm not as worried about it being perfect. It's mostly that edge. If someone puts their hand down there and touches the underside of the edge, they feel something smooth. Then I could work on the top. And I probably could have spent more time on the top. It's one of those things where it looks just fine, and then you put finish on it, and then you notice the little scratches and swirl marks you missed. And I put shellac on as the finish. I did one coat on the bottom, and I did 3 coats on the top. And it's nice because it dries really fast, and it goes on really easy. And I put finish on the legs. I did sort of the outer face and then let that dry. Then I could rest the pieces on that face and do the rest of the pieces. And I put another coat on the top. I buffed the top with some steel wool. I think in the end I ended up sanding the top with 320 sandpaper as well. Then I put on some paste wax, which I haven't really done much of, so I'm not really an expert. It looked really nice in the end, so I must have done something right. Goes on nice, and it smells nice. I have this old buffer that I picked up recently that I've been wanting to try. It's old, and the foam under the pad is starting to come apart. It worked pretty well, and it was really fast. I'm really not sure if this is how you're supposed to do it, but it worked. And I put some super glue on the bolts. And this doesn't paint the bolt black, but it turns it black. So it's a chemical of some sort that etches or patinas the zinc coating on the bolt and makes it black. And I can bring the table and the legs into the house carefully. Set the legs up. I was trying to do this by myself, which actually seemed to work okay. Have to use a hammer to get the bolt through. But once it's in there, it holds it, and it's not tight enough. The wood's really soft, like I've said, and I don't want to damage the wood by turning the bolt too tight. Then I can put the top on. It's a little tricky. But once it's in place, I can just slide it around to get the holes to line up with the legs. And with the weight of the table, they go in all the way. And we did take this apart and move it, so it's actually not hard to get it apart either. And I can slide it into place, and it amazingly is about the right height. I used the old drawings that I had for the legs for the old table, and I hadn't really checked them. And I was realizing towards the end, wondering whether it was going to be the right height or not, and it's the right height. It does wiggle just a little bit, I think there could be a little more structure on the underside. Maybe tying the legs together in pairs would help with the wiggling. Here's to a happy holidays for everyone. Thanks for watching.